Well, I'm really pleased to be here today with Samuel Wilkinson, who is an associate professor of psychiatry at the Medical School of Yale University. He's also the associate director of the Yale Depression Research Program. He earned his Bachelor of Science degree at Brigham Young University in mechanical engineering, and then went on to receive a medical degree at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. He's a well-published author, but I have to say that what caught my attention is his 2024 book entitled Purpose: What Evolution and Human Nature Imply About the Meaning of Our Existence. Now, what's striking to me is that he's talking about evolution and he's talking about meaning of our existence, which that's one of the accompaniments of evolutionary theory in some minds is that existence is meaningless, that evolutionary biology entails meaninglessness, and basically, in a sense, almost nihilism for our existence. Now, this book has gotten a really good response. You look at the jacket endorsements on the back; they're astonishing. I will just share one of them, which is from Francis Collins. That's a very famous name that some of you may be familiar with. He led the Human Genome Project, and then afterwards served under 3 presidents as the director of the NIH, the National Institutes of Health. And he described purpose, what evolution and human nature imply about the meaning of our existence, as intellectually rigorous and spiritually compelling. But I don't want you to allow that to put you off. It's intellectually rigorous, but it's approachable. It's very readable. And I loved the book and jumped at the chance of interviewing Dr. Wilkinson while he's staying here to give a lecture at BYU. And so, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for your interest in my work.
It's great to have you. Evolution has been a major obstacle for many, a major stumbling block to faith, and so it's very worth talking about. I had friends, even as an undergraduate, who left activity in the church shortly after their graduation, if not before, because of what they were learning in their evolutionary biology classes. And they could not reconcile it with the doctrine of organic evolution. That has never bothered me, but I understand it.
Yeah.
And I understand why some people are led out of the church, altogether out of theism by that. And so I think this is a really important topic to talk about. So what are some of the basic ideas of your book?
Well, I had that experience myself where I was wrestling with this, and there were 2 kind of maybe dilemmas, if you will, in particular that bothered me when I was really wrestling with what does the theory of evolution actually mean about human nature, about the purpose of our existence or the lack thereof. One of them was this sense that the way we came about, the way our bodies and all living creatures came about was a totally random and haphazard process. That would seem to me, at least, to be at odds with the sense that most people have, that life has purpose and value and meaning, right? That was number one. The second thing I didn't like about it was what it implied about human nature. And most people have heard of this phrase, survival of the fittest, and when it comes to mind, it generally connotes, social traits that are not desirable: selfishness, greed, promiscuity, so forth. And that was a dark depiction of human nature. I didn't like it, and so as I dove into this, I recognized that, well, number one wasn't really true. This wasn't a random process. There's maybe some role for randomness, but it's comparatively small against what historically I think many people have attributed to evolution. And the second part was, well, there is that part of our nature, but we also have a different part. We do have immense capacities for altruism and cooperation and so forth. And there are real, I think, plausible mechanisms in evolution that have produced these capacities that have to do, I think, in the deepest forms with family relationships. And the way I've tried to frame this is that evolution in some sense can be a very pro-family framework. So those are 2 of the things that I really wrestled with, and ultimately, for me at least, came to very satisfying conclusions that they weren't quite what I understood when I set out.
Yeah. I thought that was fascinating that for you, although you're not overtly Latter-day Saint in the book, obviously.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I should mention, by the way, for those who are wondering, he was just released about a year ago as a bishop, so he's actually active in the church. But you actually seem to have seen these discoveries, these realizations, as faith-promoting for you. Yeah. That evolution wasn't a hammer destroying faith, but in some ways was compatible with and supportive of faith.
Yeah, there have been a number of books written about how these two things can live side by side. And what I'm trying to do is say, not only can they live side by side, but the doctrine of the family, the importance of marriage, and the way this interacts with human nature, and the particular aspects of human nature that marriage seems to really harness and accentuate, to me, are mutually reinforcing. So it's not just they can. There's this biologist, Stephen Jay Gould, and he had this notion of what he called non-overlapping magistery. Right. These things can coexist, but shouldn't ever bring them together. I'm trying to kind of show that they can mutually reinforce one another. At least for me, that's the framework that I've tried to portray.
I never liked Gould's idea of the non-overlapping magistery, because what he's basically saying is evolution, science are about what's real, and then the realm of poetry and imagination and fantasy, that's the realm of religion.
Stay in your lane.
Stay in your lane. So don't make any claims, don't assert anything about the real world.
Yeah.
But as long as you're content to live in your fantasy land.
I didn't like that either.
Yeah, it's and of course he was not a believer. I don't think he realized. I think he was trying to be generous,
and sensitive,
but in fact, it came across as a bit condescending to me.
Yeah,
and so I think no, if what we believe doesn't have any implications for the real world, it doesn't make any sort of testable propositions.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about ancient history even necessarily, but just if
the way you live your life,
if it's not better in some way, if it makes no difference at all, then
what's the purpose?
What's the purpose of it?
Yeah.
I was really intrigued when you took right off with the idea of purpose in evolution. You looked at things like convergent evolution and the remarkable way in which similar features have developed over amazingly different evolutionary pathways. So there almost seems to be an end game in mind, or something that these things are aiming toward. I think you call it, what is it, higher principles or higher order principles or something like that. That I thought was really, really interesting.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think Simon Conway Morris has done a lot with that.
Yeah, and so Simon Conway Morris, for those who are not aware, he's a well-regarded biologist, paleobiologist. I think last time I checked, he was at the University of Cambridge. Very accomplished. Also happens to be a believer, but I think he mostly keeps that separate. But he, more than anyone else, has uncovered and brought together these numerous examples where things have developed and evolved in very different spheres, but have evolved kind of on the same outcomes. And so, there's this notion that, at least in theory, the outcomes of evolution were predictable.
Yeah.
And one of the, not that randomness has no role. The analogy that I like to use to try to convey how this might fit together is, it might have been like, so I have training in engineering, and there's a manufacturing process called injection molding, where you have a solid material. Most commonly these days is plastic. You heat it up, it melts, and then while it's in a liquid form, you inject it into a preformed mold or cavity, and it forms. It takes the shape of this mold, it hardens, it cools, and then you remove the mold, and you have to. This is how they make toothbrushes, plastic bottles, so forth. And if you could kind of pause the process and zoom in microscopically and look at these molecules, it looks like they're fluttering about randomly. But you take a step back, and there's a structure, there's a mold, boundary conditions, what physicists or mathematicians might call, that are constraining to go in certain directions and take a certain shape. So if you can imagine a mold like a giant tree, some of these mutations may have been random, but there's a form to this. There's a pattern, and you take a step back, and it's clearly not a random thing. Or another example is, in science we have randomized experiments where we'll take a group and randomly divide them into two or more groups, and then apply some condition to one and not the other. And there's an element of randomness there, but the overall experiment is definitely not random.
Right.
Scientists take meticulous care to make sure the conditions are exact and so forth. So it may be random. The color of your eyes may be due to random reassortment of your parents' genes, but the fact that you have eyes, they're structured the way they are, and this incredibly intricate structure seems to be, written into the inherent principles of biological matter.
Right. I think it's Stephen Jay Gould who was asked, or at some point made the comment that if you could run the tape backwards. And start over again at some point, that the end result might be very different. That, if some predator hadn't come in and destroyed some prey, the small thing, the fluttering of a butterfly in Tokyo, something like that, but just a little change here or there, random events seemingly, then the evolutionary direction would have been quite different. And Morris, I think, has said no, it would still end up running pretty well along the same lines. There would be differences, obviously, in the plot of the film, but
and the course and so forth. But the outcomes, you get the same. You get eyes, you get wings, you get body structure with the four appendages, and so these things occur over and over again, and they've developed independently. So eyes. Eyes have developed independently 40 different times. So that's remarkable. If it was just once, maybe I could believe it was chance. But 40 times, right?
That's pretty amazing. I have a little more sympathy than some people do, because I'm not a biologist, so I can have sympathies without knowing what I'm doing. But I've read some of the intelligent design literature, and some of it, I have to admit, is intriguing because I think, that is pretty unlikely for that to have happened. I read things about the Cambrian explosion and how all the major body types seem to have arisen in what is sort of a blink of an eye, geologically and paleontologically speaking. That I think to myself, this is not incompatible at all with believing in a very ancient Earth. I'm told occasionally online that I believe the world to be 6,000 years old. And that's news to me.
I won't hold it against you.
I didn't know I believed that, but if you tell me so, then I must. Because I can't remember a time when I ever did. I grew up loving dinosaurs, and I always knew these were 60 million years ago and things like that. It just never bothered me. But it does make me think that that's compatible with the idea of an overarching intelligence. That plants a garden, in effect, and wants things to come to some particular end, but uses very natural law to do it, and is perfectly aware and confident that it will turn out the way that intelligence wants it to accomplish its ends. And that's a view. I don't know that it's exactly theistic evolution. I see that term and don't always know what it means, but it seems to me it's very compatible with the Latter-day Saint understanding. We'll go down, we'll take this stuff, put it together, and we'll send these people down so they can have experience, and we'll see how they behave. And that seems to be one of the positions that your book is taking. So how did you yourself come to write the book?
It came out of really a crisis of meaning and faith. So I graduated from BYU. Within a few months of graduating, my wife and I married, and we moved to the East Coast. I grew up mostly in the East Coast, so I wasn't foreign to that area, but I enrolled at medical school and quickly realized that BYU was somewhat unique in its culture and the way that it nurtures faith. And there wasn't anyone who was antagonistic, but I felt very different. And it wasn't only science and evolution that were kind of causing this sort of crisis, but that was a part of it. And I remember wrestling and thinking about this, and it's kind of hard to describe, but it just all seemed to come together in a way that really made sense. And I remember wanting to write the book as a medical student, and I put some words on paper. I had to take a break, and I took a break for about 10 years. I had to finish my medical school, launch my family, that sort of thing, and I picked it up again really right before COVID started, and about 2.5 years wrote the book, and it was a really faith building and faith promoting process for me to see how these things, at least in my mind, came together, and I hope it for at least for some people provides some clarity about these issues as well.
As I've already mentioned, and we'll probably mention again, I loved the book.
Thank you. Thanks.
But it does make me think that maybe we could do a better job of training our own kids at BYU and wherever else. Not training them, but helping them to confront some of these issues better than we do. Because BYU is sort of a safe environment, and I don't know how these topics are addressed in biology classes because I was never a biology major. Maybe some do it well, and maybe some avoid the issue altogether. But I think of one school that I'm aware of down in Southern California. It's an overtly evangelical school. And they have a 1-year required sophomore course, which is to deal with big issues that they will face, the isms, feminism, Marxism. I don't know what they cover, but I'm sure that scientism or something like that is on their curriculum. And they expose people to serious arguments and then try to help them through in a Christian way, a way compatible with their particular evangelical beliefs. Now, I don't know whether they do it well or badly. I have no idea.
Which school is it?
That's Biola University in Southern California, which I guessed rightly. It's not far from where our parents lived in their last years. And so I used to drive by it, and I thought, Biola, I wonder if that used to be the Bible Institute of Los Angeles. Well, it was.
I didn't know that's what that
it was.
meant.
I finally looked it up, and that's where it was. But they've done some really interesting things. And again, I don't know how well they do this. And I do know that they have occasional anti-Mormon seminars there. So it wouldn't be an altogether congenial place from my point of view. But I thought, what an interesting idea, because I know too many stories of kids who've gone off from BYU who've then been confronted with some ideology or other, and it just knocked them flat. And they've lost their faith and left the church in grad school. And I think, people have free will, obviously, but which is something we'll probably come back to. But, I've thought to myself, we could, I think, lower the number of those cases if we inoculated them beforehand. Here are some issues that you'll confront. Here are some issues with the issues that you'll confront. If we could help them through that, I don't know if we do a good enough job at that. Maybe we need to do a better one. And I think your book is a really good way that would help some people.
Thank you. I'd definitely be open to helping form that sort of course.
Well, I'm retired now, and the dean that mentioned this to me once is retired. But he did. I remember one came up to me and said, "I've been thinking maybe we ought to do a class," and he outlined sort of what I just described. And I said I would be so excited to take part in something like that because. It seems to me there is value in some of the competing ideologies out there. They're not completely false. Even things like Marxism and certainly feminism and so on. But you have to learn to discriminate. What's good? What should I take from this, and what should I not?
That's something that we're not always. Well, we need to teach people to be able to do that, right? I mean, in many ways, some of what Richard Dawkins writes, I love. And then he starts talking about religion, and he's full of baloney. What are you talking about? He interestingly, there was something maybe 6 months ago how he said he considered himself a cultural Christian.
I saw that.
Everyone pounced on him. He's losing his. He's softened a bit over the years toward religion, but hardened against some of the what you might call woke, uber progressive. Anyway, but some of what he writes is beautiful. He's a beautiful writer.
Yeah, he is.
And same thing with E.O. Wilson, Edward Wilson. Some of what he writes, it's truth.
Gould was a good writer too. Really good writer.
Yeah. But you don't. There's probably no one on the planet you agree with down the line on everything.
Right.
So let's teach people to do that with these so-called academic authorities.
Speaking of Dawkins on religion, I'm trying to remember. There's a British Marxist. I'm not sure he's a believer. I don't think he is. He's definitely a Marxist in some sense or another, but a literary critic. He made a comment about Dawkins. He said, Dawkins on religion is just embarrassing. He said, it's as if you were talking with someone whose only knowledge of biology was the Big Book of British Birds, some child's book or something like that. He says it just makes you want to climb the walls, and I think that's true. It's very unsophisticated. It's maybe what he grew up with as a kid, going to compulsory religion classes in British schooling, and he's never progressed beyond that. Yeah. Whereas in biology, he has.
Yeah.
And so he contrasts a really sophisticated knowledge
of biology
with a really childish knowledge of religion.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I don't want to bash Dawkins, but he's occasionally got a target on his back. So I will say that. One of the reasons that some might be hesitant to accept evolutionary theory is because it seems to contradict our traditional accounts of creation. We have several accounts. I mean, 3 in the scriptures, then one that's central to our worship in the temple.
Yeah.
And they don't seem to talk about evolution. So how do we square these things?
Well, the short answer is I don't know. But as we were talking before we started recording, there's some really interesting patterns and. Let me back up a little bit. For me, it's pretty clear that the way that if you believe in evolution, you believe it had something to do with how we came about. It's pretty clear that we are left in a way that we're pulled in different directions. We have capacities for selfishness, but also altruism, right? And it goes down the line. Good and evil, theologically, is what we usually refer to it as. When you combine this with this empirical observation, we have the ability to choose. To me, this provides a framework that's very satisfying from an academic as well as a spiritual perspective that life is a test. It can't really be a test unless you're pulled in one direction or the other. And that, what I've tried to do is show how this makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. There's lots of things that the way evolution, natural selection, I'll use that term because it's more specific, but it can and does produce traits and capacities that are in opposition.
Right.
And I see this as very related to this principle that we learn that there must be opposition in things, in all things. So to me, those parts are very easy to bring together. Now, this notion of Adam and Eve, I'm less sure about. Now, that's not, in terms of my hierarchy of beliefs, there's some people who think that Adam and Eve are archetypes, and I don't know the ancient languages. You could probably teach me quite a bit about that. But what is that word? Where does that word Adam come from? What was the original Hebrew and that sort of thing? But I'm comfortable. I'm fine with a literal Adam and Eve. The history of writing, the history of civilization is really not that old. It's maybe 6,000. Is that a fair number to use?
Yeah.
Which kind of is in line with when the Old Testament would tell us that Adam and Eve kind of came onto the scene and started things, and the civilizations progress quite rapidly. They kind of pop out of nowhere, and it starts in Mesopotamia, I think, was the first one, and then Egypt and Indus Valley and some in the New World. And I'd be very interested to look at, how does this square? Now, the traditional understanding of genetics might say, well, that's not quite feasible and so forth. I'm okay to kind of hold that in different hands. I mean, quantum mechanics and relativity are in some ways not reconciled. And so, what can we learn from archaeology and ancient languages and civilization and so forth? And is that at odds with, genetics? And so let's just be patient and see how these things unfold. So some of it to me is very, what is the story of Adam and Eve about? It's about choice, okay? It's about power, and ultimately it's about what do we need to do to get back to God.
Yeah.
And to help us to fulfill our purpose, one of which is to choose, and the other of which is, where possible, to form families, to multiply and replenish the earth, and to have joy in our posterity. From a certain framework, evolution has something to do with that.
Yeah.
I remember when I was sitting down and thinking about this book, this phrase, that we learn about, to fill the measure of your creation, and that makes me think of evolution in some sense.
Yeah.
So,
that's fascinating. I really like that. I mean, it's clear to me that elements of the temple ceremony, for example, are obviously symbolic. You have characters meeting up in the liturgy of the temple who are thousands of years apart at best, and they stand for things. They represent things. But it occurs to me that I remember for a number of years I taught gospel doctrine. My favorite calling in the church is teaching Sunday school.
I would love to do that. I've never had that call.
Most of my adult life I've been teaching Sunday school or
I'll have to move into your ward.
Well, and anyway, I just really love it. I was a terrible bishop, but I think I'm an okay gospel doctrine teacher, or come follow me teacher or something. But we would quite often get through the New Testament year, for example, and end up with several weeks kind of at the end where I'd think, well, okay, what do I do? Well, we'd slow down and spend time on the book of Revelation, not because it's my favorite book. It's actually far from that.
It's complicated.
But I'd slow down, and there were some books I'd go to and try to help people make some sense of this thing. And it occurred to me, I'm just not that interested in understanding what this particular symbol means or that particular symbol. But it seemed to me, what is the overarching theme of Revelation? It seems to me that it's, no matter how bad things get, God is in charge. It's all part of a plan.
Yeah.
And you may not quite understand the plan, but if you hang on, you'll be okay. And then it occurred to me, okay, so we lose a lot of energy trying to figure out what do the three beasts mean, and I don't really know. I mean, I can guess, but who knows? And maybe they meant something very different to an ancient audience.
Sure, the audience around the time John was writing.
So I've depended a lot on a friend's book, Richard Draper, who wrote a book on Revelation, where he tries to go through and show what this would have meant to the audience that read it in the first century. But be that as it may, it occurred to me, okay, it's interesting that the Bible ends with a book where I think the overarching lesson isn't specifics. It's not
the beast.
Not the beast. Don't spend your time trying to figure out the details. But again, if the faithful will be all right and the unfaithful will not be so well off.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, what about the beginning of the book? A lot of time is spent on the first few chapters of Genesis trying to figure out how to reconcile them with the fossil record or with what science is telling us. And I thought, well, what if the basic message isn't spend your time trying to figure this out? It's that God is in charge. He'll be in charge at the end. In Revelation, he was in charge in the beginning. It's not random, pointless chance. This was by design. You don't know the details. You don't need to know the details. The ancient audience certainly didn't.
Sure.
And we're beginning to piece some of them together. But if the overall message is there is a point, that I think could be the message of the temple, for example. There's a point to your life. Your life has a purpose, and this is going to help you understand what it is. But you don't need to know the details. Just know that this was done by, in some sense, design. And that has helped me. So I don't lose much sleep over these things, to be honest. And people will come to me quite often and want to know, well, what does this mean? I don't know. I don't know. And I don't want to be flippant about it, but don't really care that much. Because I think the overall message is far more important.
I think, this has something to do with how there are people that care. And there are people that really kind of get, I don't want to say stuck, but they hang on. What does this mean? Whether it's some contemporary controversial issue or a historical, overall, but I do like, focus on the big picture, right? There's this psychological principle. It's called inattention blindness, and you may have heard of this fairly famous psychological experiment. They have this video of people playing basketball, and they bring participants and say, count how many times they dribbled. You got to get exactly.
Yeah.
And then a person with a gorilla suit walks across, and anything unusual you notice. Half the people don't notice the gorilla suit wearing person who walks through, and they're so focused on that they miss a bigger picture. So I think this is sometimes the mechanism by which people lose their testimonies. They're so focused on one either historical or contemporary thing that is a difficult issue, and it is important. Yeah. But the overall picture is, we are here for a purpose. We have a plan. Yeah. A family is really important to that plan, and so is developing our ability to choose. Yeah. And obviously the Savior and the temple and the scriptures and priesthood and so forth. But we hear the basics in general conference for a reason. We gotta keep getting them in there. But at least for me, this process of writing and researching this, it made me see I didn't understand this before, and now I do. And so there's a lot of things I don't understand now that I will. Yeah. And just to be patient and to take a step back and not struggle from spiritual inattention blindness.
Right. Yeah. I like that. No, I'm amazed sometimes, and I don't mean to be disrespectful to them. But once in a while I'll get notes, because I'm kind of a public lightning rod on some of these things, but I'll get notes from people who tell me the reason they lost their faith. Yeah. And sometimes they're big issues, but sometimes I'm thinking, seriously? That was what took you out?
What's the milk curds of
the story of Thomas Marsh.
What milk something?
Yeah, it was something to do with the
strips.
milk.
Yeah,
and
something along those lines. It's not worth your eternal.
I served my mission in Switzerland. I wasn't going to tell the story. It's very short, I promise. But I tracked it out a person once who had been active in the church. Until the dedication of the Swiss temple. I served in Switzerland, and that had been 20 years before almost. But what had taken him out, it turned out, he told me the story himself, was that he had been sitting there in the dedicatory service or just before, and someone came by and pointed out that he had a spot on his tie, but apparently did it in a very unkind way. So he saw it. I don't know.
Sure.
And he'd never been back to church since. And I thought, that's it? Seriously? That person who pointed out that you had a spot on your tie may not even remember saying it, and it's been, by that point, 20 years. Yeah. You chose to leave the church over that. Now, that's amazingly ridiculous to my point of view, but I've seen others where I've thought, boy, you lost the big picture. And you were so focused on this one issue where quite often, and it's just me, but I just think, but that's an issue that I've known about for a long time. It's never bothered me at all. I'm sort of mystified by why one thing will bother one person and not another, and that sort of thing. But evolution certainly has been one of those, or the perceived clash between naturalistic science and the gospel worldview. I'm discussing with a person right now who's obviously an ex-member. Just for him, everything comes down to particle physics. And spirit beings are not possible, because our view of the standard model of particle physics rules them out. And so we're talking about the witnesses to the Book of Mormon. And I think, I kind of prefer to examine historical issues with historical tools. I never would have occurred to me to bring quantum physics into a discussion of the witnesses, but that did it for him. So all religious claims, all spiritual claims are obviously false because they don't fit that physical model. I just find that odd, but we have to address people where they are.
And I don't mean to make light of
not at all.
It is, people really struggle, and not that some of these issues aren't really important. They're hard. Mortality is hard. Mortality is hard. The things that have gotten me have sometimes been quite unrelated to anything scientific or scholarly, where you face a real test or something goes wrong with someone that you care about. And it's hard.
My word, this is difficult. Well, okay. Your book seems to allude to several themes that are in some ways unique to theology from of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and yet obviously it's not an overtly Latter-day Saint book. It's it's published by
Pegasus Books.
Yes, by a completely Latter-day Saint press, and you're speaking to a non-Latter-day Saint audience, and so you emphasize the notion that life is a test, which is very Latter-day Saint.
Yeah.
I don't think it's peculiar to us, but we emphasize it a lot. And the idea that there must be opposition, that's we've alluded to that already.
Yeah.
Absolutely bedrock scriptural teaching, and something that is, I think, somewhat, well, I won't say it's unique again, but it's peculiarly emphasized in the Latter-day Saint idea or model. I've read some accounts where they say, wouldn't it have been wonderful if Adam and Eve had just never fallen and stayed in the garden, then our lives would be wonderful. And I think we say, no, that would have defeated the whole plan.
Yeah, that was part of the...
you have to get out there and experience the lone and dreary world and run into things that challenge you. The example I've given when I was a bishop, I would have people who came in occasionally with terrible problems that they were facing. And I felt, talk is cheap because this is not a temptation or a problem that I face, and how can I counsel them without seeming overly facile?
Yeah.
But one thing I did say sometimes was, I don't envy you. I'm sorry you're going through this, but in some ways, it'd be like it's like going to the gym. If you go to the gym and you lift quarter-pound weights, well, it's not doing you a whole lot of good. What's important for us is resistance. You've got to try to lift heavy things, or do it a lot. That's what builds up strength and capacity, and so on. And so we have to face these things, miserable as it might sometimes be. We, according to the Latter-day Saint view, we wanted to come here. I think it was maybe a slightly ignorant choice. Oh yeah, give me challenges. We didn't know what it meant.
Well, I think so. That reference might be to Job. Is that?
Yeah.
Well, you have to consider the source, right? Job was probably pretty.
Yeah.
He was, anything to him that wasn't, his family dying,
right,
might have been rejoicing. So
right.
Consider the source.
Yes.
Is what a friend of mine will sometimes.
Yeah.
But
absolutely.
Certainly, this is, there was some element of choice.
Yeah.
In coming here, right?
But the whole point of coming here is that when you were making that choice, you didn't know exactly what it would be like, because that's why we needed to come.
Yeah.
We might have known in theory. I can know in theory what it's going to be like when I get to some place I've never visited.
Yeah.
Read books about it and so on, seen pictures. But the reality is always a little different than I pictured.
Yeah.
So, well, also the importance of the family to building a good society. You've alluded to that. Now, one question is, did you intentionally insert these for an LDS audience?
No, I mean, I would say no. I wrote this not for an LDS. I wrote this for a broad audience as much as possible. I think these things just emerge organically from reality. I mean, so many of my sources, I think I quote Gordon B. Hinckley once, and maybe, but everything else. And I've got about 30 or 40 references per chapter. So, I think these things just emerge organically. I think they're part of reality. So let me share one thing, if I may. So what is the root of human happiness, right? This is something that social scientists are obviously interested in, and it's a complex question, but I think there's a pretty good consensus that relationships are the most important thing in human happiness, well-being, and so forth. And one of the things I'm interested in is, where does this come from? What is the origin to this? And I remember a conversation with a colleague, more a friend colleague, who said, well, that's how God made us. And so that's great. I need a more earthbound explanation. I can't write that in a journal.
Right.
And so if you subscribe, as I do, that evolution has something to do with the way that we were created, came into existence, our bodies at least, then that might have something to do with relationships. And if that's the case, then the relationships of greatest biological relevance are those with whom we share our genetic, our family relationships. And certainly I think, relationships have always served us so well from a survival and thriving perspective. But a big part of this, I think, has to do with the unique relationship between parents, particularly mother, women, and children, also men in some degree. But this has to do with what's called attachment theory. So there's a psychiatrist I admire immensely, a man named John Bowlby. He's since passed away. He was born in the early 1900s and he died in the late 1900s. And he came of age professionally at the time when some of the now outdated theories of Sigmund Freud still held great sway. And one of which was that relationships weren't really that important. They were a means to an end. This is quid pro quo thing. You know, a man loves his wife because the woman gives him sex. A baby loves the mom because the mom gives the baby milk, that sort of, you know, food. It's very transactional, quid pro quo. And, you know, there, in fact, there's this funny, another a psychologist who's a very eminent psychologist, basically in a book he wrote in the 1920s, warned mothers not to love your children very much. He said, don't ever hug them. Shake hands with them if you must in the morning. Don't kiss them, you know, because mother love is a dangerous instrument which may wreck your, you know, adult son or daughter's chance for, you know, happiness. And I mean, it's amazing that we thought these guys were experts. By the way, this book that he wrote was heralded as a godsend in a little-known magazine called The Atlantic in the 1920s. So Bowlby saw this and he recognized this was absurd. He said, you know, even in animals, you know, so much of what behavior does is it forms these relationships. And so he came about with this attachment theory, and a lot of it was rooted in this observation that human infants are utterly helpless at their birth. Okay, everything a baby can do, in part, so cry, coo, suck, you know, smile, laugh, is in part intended to draw the parent close, and that's adaptive from an evolutionary perspective. If that doesn't happen, the baby doesn't survive. Now we are at the total end of this spectrum. Okay, there are other animals. You know, the first thing a giraffe does when it's born is it falls 6 feet to the ground. The mothers give birth standing up, but a giraffe can walk within like 30 minutes. Or can you imagine a human baby like that would be a little different experience as a parent. And so what he theorizes is that, you know, there is this on the part of the baby, but also the parent, there's this intense attachment. Okay, and that is, I think, in my perspective, that is where the strongest forms of love in the flesh come from. The way that the parent-child relationship has been molded. And when you think of what does that imply about love? Well, you know, we love our kids, all right? And a cynical person might say, well, you know, are you saying I just love them because I have my genes? I said, well, God made you in such a way that you have a deep love for your children, okay? But that's inevitably linked with the demanding nature of being a parent, right? So if you take 100 parents and you ask them, what's the most challenging thing you've done? Most of them in some form will say, raise my kids. If you ask them, what's the most rewarding thing you've done? Most of them in some form will say, raise my kids. I think those two are linked, right? So it's a silly kind of half serious thought experiment. What would our social lives be like if we were seahorses? You know, seahorses are different in several ways. One is which the males get pregnant. So this would probably lead to some different parental leave policies. Another way in which they're different is that when they're born, there is essentially no parental investment. The parents say, goodbye, good luck, hope you don't get eaten, pass on my genes. Now, no one knows exactly what it's like to be a seahorse, but there's a good bet that they don't feel a deep sense of love and attachment for their kids. That's just not the strategy that nature has kind of equipped them with. So to me, this kind of, at least at the confluence of biology and psychology, you can't have this deep love without compelling sacrifice. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And obviously there's some kind of theological overtones or implications to that for me are quite interesting and satisfying.
Well, we find, I think, even in I've seen it in sociology of religion, that religions that demand a lot of attention, a lot of involvement, investment, tend to do better than ones that where the relationship is superficial and lacking.
Yeah.
And you know, just causes learning to care for other people. When you first meet them, you have no particular relationship, but if you invest in them, you've spent time with them, you come to care about them. Yeah. I think that makes sense. And obviously the most important is parental love. Good. Well, some Latter-day Saints point to statements by certain church leaders who are opposed to evolution. There are plenty of those.
Yep.
And they conclude that a good Latter-day Saint can't believe in evolution. What would you say to that?
I'd say the church has a neutral position, and that there are opposing viewpoints. David O. McKay, Talmage, and some of these other a little more scientifically minded. And I think I'm definitely sympathetic to the statements that have been made, but I think there has been a misperception as to what does evolution actually mean. And one of these is the randomness part, right?
Yeah.
If it were totally random, then yeah, I can see why there'd be this pushback. But in the last couple decades, as things have kind of come together, I think it's a different picture than what some of those church leaders were preaching against, right? I think, this notion that life is purposeless, I agree with that. That we need to push back against that. But so that's what I would say, and I think again for me, I think this has been very faith affirming.
I saw a poll some years ago, and I should have looked it up, but it was of religious groups in the United States, which group rejected evolution at the highest percentage, what proportion rejected it the most. And I think Latter-day Saints came in as the group most likely to reject evolution.
Really?
Or anyway, pretty high.
I would think evangelicals.
I would have thought so too. And, and I may be wrong in remembering it, but I thought, well, why would Latter-day Saints, we're usually fairly science-friendly.
Sure.
And have been historically. I mean, there have been studies in the past on the number of Latter-day Saints who've gone on into the sciences, and it's unusually high, or was. I don't know if it still is. Maybe now we'd all do MBAs or something. but I thought, well, I could see why people would object, and it is that sense, which some evolutionary propagandists, I think, push.
Yeah.
That, what it discloses is not only nature red in tooth and claw, but a world that doesn't care about you.
Yeah.
The universe there's nothing but pitiless indifference
all the way down.
And so on. And so I thought, well, I reject that. Viscerally, I reject that. As a Latter-day Saint, I can't accept it. Mm-hmm. I'm less concerned about the mechanics of how life arose. Mm-hmm. But if those are the necessary entailments, then I have to say no. Mm-hmm. And so I've thought if I were confronted with a poll question, a survey question, do you accept evolution or do you not? If it's a simple toggle switch, yes or no, then I don't know how I'd answer it. If it goes with that other stuff, I'd say no. But if it doesn't, then I'd say yeah.
Yeah. And this word evolution is problematic because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So and some might disagree with me. I would break it down into three parts. And one is this principle of natural selection, which I think is very powerful and very there's a huge amount of evidence that it shaped things, it shapes behaviors, physical traits, and us to a large degree. There's another principle of speciation. Okay, that species can diverge and one species can become two if the two groups separate over a long period of time. And there's another which is universal common descent, which is kind of every living thing started from a single cell in the primordial soup some 4 billion years ago. And I might get in trouble for this, but I think we have different levels of confidence in those three. I am very confident in the first, in natural selection. Natural selection has shaped us for better and for worse. There's definitely a good amount of evidence for speciation that it happens, but universal. I mean, a single cell. Why are we limited to one? This concept of randomness, throwing that out that's very disruptive in a sense. Darwin himself in the last page of The Origin of Species, his most famous book, seemed to make room that could have been at least a few original life forms. So I don't know why we're limited to one. Now I don't know that has huge religious implications. I think it's a trivial difference if there's one single cell versus like a dozen. But what if there's like thousands?
No.
That, and again, that's not mainstream consensus biology, so I might get myself in trouble, but it's an interesting thing to ponder.
in that sense, humans may or may not be related to asparagus.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. There's a great line from so 1925 was the so-called Scopes monkey trial, where they had this teacher that they put on trial because there's a new law passed, you couldn't teach anything against the Bible, and they brought one of the students there and interviewed him, you know, put him in court and under oath and so forth, and was asking him, you know, what he was being taught and so forth, and his one-liner that I thought was great, says, "Well, I believe in most of evolution, but I don't believe about the monkey business," you know? Which I thought was great.
Yeah. That trial in itself is a really interesting thing. There's a book that came out, maybe you've seen it a long time ago, called Summer for the Gods or Summer of the Gods.
Yeah, no, I read that. I read that. And
where
I
it turned out the trial was very different than what I had imagined it to have been.
Well, it was kind of a publicity stunt by the local townsman, and then it worked, at least for 6 or 8 weeks.
Who thinks of that place?
Yeah.
Except in terms of that trial and the play that was made from it and so on. Mm-hmm. Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you.
I don't know if you have any last parting thoughts you would like to make.
Just that if you struggle with this issue or any issue, just try to be patient. Just focus on the bigger picture. There's a God. There's a purpose to our existence. One of these purposes, I'm very convinced, from both secular and religious sources, that is to choose between these competing dispositions within us, good and evil, and how and why the family is so important to that.
I mean, as you've been talking, I've been thinking about the idea of the natural man.
Yeah.
I think, boy, I mean, evolution gives us the natural man. You've got the spirit that comes from somewhere else, and then it's attached to an organic machine, some people say, but an organic, an organism that may have very different preferences from the spirit. Mm-hmm. We all know that from a matter, personal introspection.
Yeah,
I may resolve to do X, Y, and Z, but when push comes to shove,
the flesh is weak.
The flesh is weak. Yeah, and the scriptures are full of that kind of language. And I've told people have asked me sometimes, have you ever had a serious testimony crisis? Well, I've had issues over the years, but I tell people the biggest testimony challenge for me has been when I've been in leadership positions, when the alarm goes off really early in the morning. I don't know if the gospel's true. I don't even want it to be true. I just want to roll over and go back to sleep because the body is so darn tired.
Yeah.
And, so it is body and spirit sort of dueling for control.
Well, and I mean, I want to just add a little bit of nuance to this because at least the way I frame it, and I think our doctrine is clear on this. We don't think the body's all evil.
Right.
And there are other scriptures that say ye are the temple of God.
That's right.
And the temple, I think that, you bring to mind tabernacle, something physical.
Right.
And so, and there's this notion that, we can't have a fullness of joy.
Right.
Unless there's spirit and body. So there's a part of our flesh that is weak and is the natural man, but there's another part that has capacities for goodness, and that's what we're...
Yeah, and I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. It oversimplifies it a little bit. We're not Manichaeans. We're not Gnostics who believe that the free spirit blundered into this horrible world and is just trying to get out.
Yeah.
Because we do believe that the body will actually go with us eventually. So it's going to be redeemed.
Yeah.
But it does... many people have families who otherwise selfishly would never bother to because there are the physical things that move us, and we're moved to do better than we sometimes would by those internal urges that come to us from our biological programming. Well, thank you very much for spending the time with me, and I want to again give an advertisement, and I really mean this. This, I think, is a great book.
Thank you.
So, Purpose by Samuel T. Wilkinson, subtitle, What Evolution and Human Nature Imply About the Meaning of Our Existence. And I think for those who are puzzled by the question of evolution, also for those who aren't particularly, this is a really wonderful book, and it's... you'll learn a great deal, and I think you'll be, as I was, actually inspired by it. So I've thoroughly enjoyed it and recommend it very highly.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for being here.